reminder wasn't here tonight, and I never remember. So, okay, sorry about the being there. So the the amazing feature of the first Hebrew-speaking city in 2,000 years to get its title from a book that is written the very moment that that first new city springs root. The city began Tel Aviv in its foundational phase, 1902, incorporated as Tel Aviv in 1910. It's Achuzat Bayit in 1909, but the beginnings are 1902, the very year that Herzl publishes his novel. So let's have a little bit of discussion about what's this novel all about. And I'm going to read you a little brief description, and then we'll look at something together on the screen. Yeah, the program is not being recorded. You have to shut it up, Paula, because I didn't read the chat. You have to, I don't read the chat. So it is now being recorded, but it's a little late, unfortunately. So the first, I'll have to do a private rendition of the first 8 minutes, whoever, for somebody who wants it. Okay, so what is this novel about? And it's really peculiar. I'll give you a brief synopsis of what the novel's about. It's available. The whole thing is accessible. You get the whole novel online. It appears in, if you Google Altneuland, it's available English translation online in 5 different books: book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, book 5. It's not easy reading. No one is fighting for the movie rights anytime soon. But this book does have an enormous influence, not only in the naming of a city, but in furthering the Zionist dream. So it's a novel, right? It's not, Herzl had already written a manuscript, a tract, the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, which he wrote, I believe, in 1895, I believe. And he had written, articles. He'd written plays. And he was a good writer, a good playwright. He was a successful writer. He was a newspaper columnist for the Neue Freie Press, the New Free Press of Paris. That's where he intersected with the Dreyfus trial. Although contemporary historians indicate that the Dreyfus trial really did not have the influence on him that we've always thought. He reported it. He kind of thought at the beginning that the Dreyfus was guilty. It didn't really interest him. What did interest him was the anti-Semitism that resulted. And it was the anti-Semitism to which he reacted, not to the Dreyfus case, which didn't really seem to interest him a whole lot. That goes against, we all said he was at the trial and that's what made him a Zionist. Not quite true. He already was into the idea of a Jewish homeland prior to this travel. It was the anti-Semitism that resulted that furthered his ambition. So very briefly, what's the plot of Altneuland? The story of Friedrich Loewenberg, a young Jewish Viennese intellectual. And the source, what I'm reading from very briefly, is a very great and illustrious source called Wikipedia. But there's actually a good article on Altneuland, which if you want to read the whole thing, I recommend you look it up. So it's the story of this young Jewish intellectual, tired with European decadence. He joins an Americanized Prussian aristocrat named Kingscourt. They retired to a remote Pacific island, and stopping in Jaffa on their way to the Pacific, they find Palestine to be a backward, destitute, and sparsely populated land, as it appeared to Herzl on his visit in 1898. So Loewenberg and Kingscourt, they spend the following 20 years on the island. They're cut off from civilization, and they use this time to envision an ideal new society, often termed a utopian society, that will become their blueprint for a Jewish state. Now, I want to just show you something else. I'm going to share this with you. Give me a second. Yeah, it's interesting that the article about Altneuland in the New Encyclopedia Judaica, it's under the article that is Jewish science fiction and fantasy, not under anything connected to Israel. It's only a part of that article because it deals with all Jewish science fiction throughout ancient times, modern times. But there's one segment of the article, I'm going to look at a tiny bit of it with you, that deals with Israel and Altneuland, which he indicates that in a sense is Jewish science fiction. So he begins here by saying, the writer here is Shelton Teitelbaum, and I think he wrote this part, not Eli Hirschstein, is also accredited. 1948, the Jewish state becomes the state of Israel, only country in the world, as I've already said, to be partly inspired by a science fiction novel. Altneuland, written by Herzl, and the pamphlet, his earlier pamphlet in 1896, The Jewish State, Creed Accord, lamenting the deplorable condition of Jews throughout the European diaspora. And again, he visited Israel. I believe the only time he went was in 1898, and conditions were really bad. And he also said this was not the dream. He was going to posit the dream, and he does so in this novel. The very famous Herzl quotation emanates from this book, Im tirtzu ein zo agada. If you will it, Herzl declares in an utterance that resounds with a science fiction sensibility, it is no dream. Of course, the translator reflects on agada, connects it to the depths of Jewish tradition, but that's one of the very famous quotations from Altneuland, and I suspect that most of the text is not considered that memorable today. Again, it's accessible if you're really dedicated and want to read it. It's available online. Google Altneuland or Old New Land, and you can get the whole translated article in English. Again, it's not that easy to read, but it's all there if you want to read it. The good thing about many of these writings that are, more than a century old, there's no copyright on them anymore, so they can be all online. You can also find The Jewish State available online as well for a free download if you want to. It's also, again, it's not light bedtime reading, but if you want to read that's his tract on creating a state. But here he's talking about the idea that one can do this as long as you have the will, the dedication to do it. And then it says he eventually tries to dissociate Zionism from the utopian discourse that turned to vogue in the 19th century. And this article goes into great detail, which I'm not going to, about various influences that Herzl had. One of them is H.G. Wells, who makes his debut in 1895 with The Time Machine. And Herzl is influenced by H.G. Wells and many other writers of note of that period in the waning years of the 19th century. So, and there are other publications as well that novels that deal with this theme. The idea being that one is creating a utopia. That's the vision, not just to create a land, not just to create a country where people can live, but a perfect country, a country that the world has never seen, with its excellence, with its dedication. And I think, again, part of the reason why I opened with the happiness survey was to say that we did something right. We did a lot right. Another thing that he does here, by the way, and it's referenced in this article, I don't think I gave you that part, but he very much emphasizes the need for technology. So in their most, basically, he felt that there was a need to have major universities to capture technology, to be a technological leader in the world. And we all know that has happened. That has happened. Israel is one of the technological wonders of the world. And so that was an example of Herzl's vision being fulfilled with, the land reflecting a lot of ideal, even with a lot of difficulty. There's a lot, you have the idea of, for example, of Toar HaNesher, you have the idea of, one second, I just closed my share by mistake. We had the idea of, the idea of Israel being a light to the nations, of there being, of really not creating a state just to create a state. It's kind of like I tell people, I think I can stop sharing right now. It's kind of like telling people who want to convert to Judaism, and I was part of a few conversions this past week, and one of the things that's important to me is that one does not go through a conversion just to be a non-practicing Jew. That's not the purpose. Don't bother. The idea of tradition, where we want people to take on some observance, we're not expecting people to go through our program to become Hasidim, It's happened before, but not too often. But we do expect people to want to live that Judaism, wanting that to be a significant part of their life. If it's going to be irrelevant to them and just to make the wedding more comfortable for grandparents and parents, it's questionable whether that is advisable. And that's where the Orthodox take a very strong stand, and I don't think they're totally wrong on that. It's a difficult issue, and this is not the topic tonight, but the idea here also is the idea of creating a Jewish homeland. In Herzl's terminology, his understanding was to come as close to utopia, to perfection as possible. And he's writing a time when utopian visions are big. I mean, today the people will laugh at that, but that was in the late 19th, end of the 19th century, that was commonplace, and he was a man of his time. But so Altneuland is this idea that, and it's a very convoluted story. It's kind of hard to follow. I'm not going to go into depth, but interestingly, more than anything, the name of the book and one key line live on. I mean, every Israeli and a lot of Jews outside of Israel have heard the phrase "Im tirtzu ein zo agada." If you will, it is not a legend, it is not a dream. And everyone knows the name Tel Aviv. And if you look, what is the origin of Tel Aviv? The origin story goes back to the Hebrew translation of Altneuland. So those are the two living legacies. But I don't want to dismiss Herzl, because understand that his vision basically was fulfilled. His vision was, it happened. He talks about, let me see, I think I have it here. If I can find it. Excuse me one second. Yeah, this is what I want. 1 second. This is an article I need. Give me a second. I have to find it. Okay, share screen. Yeah, it's this one. Yeah, okay, perfect. So this is an article that appears in Mosaic, a online journal that I highly recommend. This is a short piece of that article by Rick Richmond. I don't know him, but it's a good article. And he talks a bit about Herzl, the person. And there's a lot of surprising facts about Herzl. He's not the person you would expect to be doing what he did. So he asked the question, how did a man opposed by Orthodox rabbis who believed that a Jewish state should await the Messiah, and some to this day hold that view, Reform rabbis who wanted a Jewish state relegated permanently to the past, assimilated Jews who feared accusations of dual loyalty, Jewish socialists who considered any type of nationalism reactionary, and Jewish public figures who thought the whole idea absurd. So how did this man create a worldwide movement? How did a young writer with no political connections, with no ties to Jewish organizations, no financial backing beyond his own resources, how did he negotiate with leading figures in the Western world's ruling empires, engaging in what Bibi Netanyahu would call inconceivable diplomatic actions that would lead to the Balfour Declaration and eventually the creation of the State of Israel? Important questions. But even more important question is, why did Herzl do this? He had minimal ties to Judaism and the Jewish people during his early adulthood. While he had a bar mitzvah, attended a predominantly Jewish high school, he had sought assimilation ever since his days as a university student in Vienna, nor was he religiously observant as an adult. When his son was born in 1891, he did not have him circumcised. December 24th, 1895, my birthday many years before I was born, 6 weeks before the publication of the Jewish state, Herzl was at home lighting a Christmas tree for his 3 children. He's the founder of the State of Israel. For many years, biographers believed Herzl had become a Zionist after covering the Dreyfus trial in 1894 as a foreign correspondent for a Viennese newspaper. But as I said before, scholars have shown that Herzl's embrace of Zionism had very little, if not anything at all, to do with the Dreyfus case. So it's a mystery. He comes out of nowhere. Beginning of 1895, nobody would have predicted that this 35-year-old literary editor of Vienna's Neue Freie Press would propose the formation of a Jewish state, present the idea to London's Jewish elite, publish his historic pamphlet, the Judenstaat, establish the political, financial, and intellectual institutions for a state in waiting, negotiate with emperors, kings, dukes, ministers, the Pope, and the Ottoman Sultan, hold 6 Zionist congresses attracting hundreds of delegates from more than 20 countries and regions around the world, their numbers increasing each year, produced 2 remarkable diplomatic achievements in 1903, setting the stage for the Balfour Declaration, and then he dies heartbroken less than a decade after he began in 1904 at the age of 44. 1897, by the way, you'll notice 125th anniversary of the first Zionist Congress is coming up, in Basel is coming up. I'm being invited to attend a 125th anniversary celebration in Basel. Hopefully conditions will allow me to attend, we'll see. But so a few days after the first Zionist Congress concludes in Basel, this is very famous, I've quoted this in sermons frequently, he writes in his diary that he had founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, he wrote in 1897, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years and certainly in 50, everyone will know it. 1947, 50 years later, the United Nations endorses a Jewish state in Palestine. 6 months after that, Ben Gurion proclaims its independence in Tel Aviv, a city that did not exist in 1897. Under a massive photograph of Herzl, many of you have been, some of you with me, to the Hechal HaAtzmaut, Independence Hall in Tel Aviv, and you see the room is set up the way it was in 1947, and the big picture of Herzl there on the wall, and that's where the state is declared 50 years almost to the moment after he says, certainly in 50 years, everybody will know that a Jewish state will happen. How do you read this history and not get goosebumps? How do you read this history and not say, wow, this is one of the great wow moments of Jewish life? And he really doesn't answer the question. We don't really know. And it's hard to imagine how why Herzl does this. And it's really hard to imagine because it doesn't seem fitting to his character. And I've often, it's one of my favorite sermon topics, so I'm not going to give the sermon because you've heard it before, some of you. But I've always felt that we diminish the contribution sometimes of secular Jews to the Jewish future. The state of Israel, I've mentioned this previously, I think, in this course. Israel, secular Jews have been foundational in the creation of Israel. Maybe it was the fact they weren't so linked to the past that they had the free will in order to leap, in order to imagine that which did not exist. Basically, classical Jews only imagine something if it appears in the Gemara. And I love Gemara. I'm doing Daf Yomi now regularly. It's difficult, very tough. Masechet now, Yevamot, very tough. But I'm really into it. I love Gemara. But Herzl recognized that there will be things that we have to do, resources that we have to take advantage of that may not necessarily find root in the Talmud or root in Hebrew scripture. Although, interestingly, some of the secularists like Ben Gurion, who was a wholly secularist, but was a great Bible scholar, felt very connected to the Hebrew Bible. Herzl, I'm not sure. Herzl wanted the language of Israel to be German. He wasn't really convinced of Hebrew being the language, but people like Akiva Weiss and Eliezer ben Yehuda won that argument, thankfully, and Hebrew became the language of the Jewish state. But there was talk because most of the founders spoke German and very few of them spoke Hebrew at that time. But they understood something, that language is critical. And taking a language that was part of our ancient history and reviving that language would help further the miracle of the resurgence of a Jewish state. And obviously they were right. So that is an introduction to Herzl. I want to read something, just a very brief paragraph that's written by a great writer whose name is, I should remember, Anita Shapiro, an Israeli writer, Anita Shapiro, who's written a biography of Herzl and a history of Israel, highly recommended. She writes the following, it's also appeared in Mosaic, conclusion to an article about Herzl, very powerful one paragraph. To die young is an advantage to a leader. Herzl, dying suddenly at the age of 44, remained forever young in the memory of the nation. The Jewish people mourned him, including those who had criticized him. A young boy in a backwater shtetl wrote to a friend that such a leader who combined the heroism of the Maccabees with the stratagems of David, the beauty of Rabbi Yehuda the prince, and the courage of Rabbi Akiva would never appear again. This boy's name was David Grun, who would later change his name when he made Aliyah to David Ben-Gurion. In a way, the photograph of Ben-Gurion reading the Declaration of Independence with the picture of Herzl behind him is a fitting homage to the legend of Herzl. I want to let you hear another voice for a few moments, and then we can talk, see if you have questions and things you want to say. And that is, I'm going to actually play you a little selection from an audiobook, which I've never done before. And if it, please tell me in the chat if you can't hear this. I did test it, it did work. But do me a favor and tell me if on the chat if you have a problem hearing this. I want to tell you the book that I'm going to be highlighting. The book is entitled Israel, A Simple Guide to the Most Misunderstood Country on Earth. The author is Noah Tishby. She's a lot of fun. She does, like, she's lighthearted in her, and she actually narrates the book that she wrote. But she's a person of great talent. She's an actress. She's a singer. She was in part of the Israel Armed Forces in their band. She basically starred in many Israeli television shows. She starred in many shows that are American shows. CSI Miami, CSI New York, Nip and Tuck, Las Vegas, Star Trek Enterprise, NCIS, The Affair. There are many others, a whole biography of a filmography of her. And you may have seen on HBO, which I guess has brought it to Canada somehow, called In Treatment, which is an Israeli series called BT Pool, which she produced. So a very accomplished writer, and actor, actress, and singer, and producer, and mogul, basically. But she also is a very committed Zionist. And she wrote this beautiful book, which I highly recommend. So I'm going to play just a brief excerpt when she talks about, let her talk about Herzl and what he means to her. Let me just see if I can do this. Second. Okay, here we go. And again, give me a chat to me if this doesn't work. I think it should, because I did test it.
After 3 days, the delegates agreed to the following main points.
He's talking about he's talking about the first Zionist Congress that I mentioned. So he's talking about 3 points the delegates agreed to. Did you all hear that? Are we hearing?
Yes.
Okay, good. We're going on now.
Zionism.
There we go. I did want to stop this. So I hope you enjoyed that. I think she's great. And so, it's a book that deals with a lot of issues that are extremely, extremely significant to contemporary Israel, explaining a view of Palestinian conflict, of Israeli politics, of issues, that confront Israeli society. She's a fairly, I don't say a hardliner, but she's, I guess I would say she's slightly right of center, where, I find it comfortable, but she's really, as you can see, very good. When she has a personal relationship with Herzl, she calls him Theo. She's fun, in a sense, but it's really captivating. And I felt that was just, I was listening to it in the car. So I recommend the book or the Audible download if you listen to books sometimes. These days when I have to drive to Pardes Chaim Cemetery, or from where I'm living to Beth David, I have long drives, so I end up listening to books. I'm fed up with listening to the news, even though I used to love listening to the news. It's just too depressing. So, I highly recommend this, and I hope I give you a taste of a very talented person and a very, very good writer, who basically makes some very important points. And, I reiterated what I said, and then she said it better, the whole miracle, in a sense, of Herzl's vision. And it's coupled in the drama, again, is that this is a guy that one really could not have expected that he would have the influence that he had. I wonder how he would feel if he would know that in 2022, that Israel would be the 9th happiest country in the world out of like 160 countries that are on the survey. And ahead of Canada, ahead of the US, ahead of Britain, it's unfathomable that, in other words, there's something really successful here. And that's probably one of the reasons why a lot of our adversaries are not happy, because I hate to say it, largely because of their leadership and their unwillingness to really seriously sit down and talk constructively or adhere to agreements. That our neighbors do not have any kind of equal success, and we're going to be number 9, and they're going to be probably 150 in terms of the world standard of happiness. And that could be different. I mean, if they, Israel, I think, would help and would want to help to elevate our neighbors. And she does talk about that in the book in subsequent chapters. I think that's something that we have to realize. Israel gets a lot of flack. We know that. And even at a time when the world is Meshiga, when there's such crisis and such events that are taking the attention of the world, and the tragedy happening in Ukraine. So McGill and other universities managed to find ways to vote against Israel. This is very, very important right now. That's really the top priority. And a lot of the universities, thankfully, are not allowing those plans to go through. But it's an uncomfortable reality that that we see, even at a time when that shouldn't be your fault. Who cares right now? It's not. And it's not. There's so much horrific suffering in the world, not caused by Israel. Israel sets up field hospitals in Ukraine. I have friends who are Israeli rabbis who are in Poland right now, greeting and caring for refugees from Ukraine. And to their credit, they're not going for a day for a photo op, like some of my colleagues have done in Canada and in New York, for say. They go for a day and a half. They have their picture taken and they come home. And I have friends on the ground who say that that's not something that helps them. You don't do you go, if you're going to really work, spend a couple of weeks there and really help the people, counsel and do this and teach. And that's something that, that one could be more impressed with. I was sharing, I don't consider myself to be the world's greatest tzaddik, maybe in the top 3,000, I don't know, but not the world's greatest tzaddik. But I was sharing with somebody a memory of when I did a mission to Israel during the Gulf War, and in 1991, I believe it was. And I went by myself because nobody was going to Israel. And I told the story. I was the only guest in the Sheraton Hotel in Tel Aviv, the only non-Israeli guest in. So when they said welcome guest, they could have just had a welcome to me because I was the only guest. And there were nobody was there. They only had journalists and Israelis who were seeking shelter in Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, because the Tel Aviv is where the scuds were falling. But I said, when I did that, I was there for 2 weeks. And I'm happy to say I was never photographed during those 2 weeks. I don't like being photographed, but it was not, the photo op was the last thing from my mind. I'd raised funds from Beth David, purchased things from a kibbutz, Israeli products, because the Israelis who were being scudded out of their apartments in Ramat Gan, they needed something to wear in bed that they could go to a safe room in. They didn't want to go in pajamas. It was not dignified. It was not sneistic. So there was a desperate need for what in Hebrew is known as training gim. We call them in English tracksuits. So I did research then, and I found out, is there a kibbutz or someplace that makes tracksuits in Israel? And lo and behold, a friend directed me to a kibbutz. And through Beth David's generosity 31 years ago, we raised at the time about $25,000. I was able to get a whole bunch of training gim and bring them to families and I was visiting Haredi families in Bnei Brak. It was the most incredible experience of my life. But if you're going to do it, you go to help. You don't go to get a photo op. So that's a digression that has nothing to do with. But I am saying that I'm proud of our people in Israel, our Israeli leadership, and our, many of my Israeli colleagues who have gone to Ukraine and to Poland to do real work and to stay for a while. It's hard. They're leaving their families. There's a bit of risk involved, of course. It's not a place that it's not a great vacation spot right now. But they're going and they're working hard and making a difference. They're also helping people who want to come to Israel. They're finding places for them to stay. That is, that's part of Israel. That's part of Herzl's vision. That's part of the utopia. We don't like the word anymore, but we want to create a country where people, that doesn't sound good, where people are able to, where Israel is able to export humanity. And Israel's great. Israel is on any tragedy. Israel's the first there. And, you read these stories about when there's, earthquakes and other tsunamis, Israel sends, relief. They set camps, they send doctors, they send medical teams. And there was this baby, I forget where, that was born in an Israeli field hospital in one of these godforsaken places. And they named the baby Israel. This is gratitude for that Israelis had helped save the life of their child. So that's the kind of stuff that was Herzl's vision. And it is something that that unfolds daily. Of course, there's a lot of other stuff. Israel is far from perfect. We all know that. Israel makes mistakes. It's not easy to face adversaries. I'd love to see any other country, try to match Israel's record, having terrorist attacks coming in from the border. If in St. Catherine's was sending rockets to Buffalo, how long would it take the Americans to intervene? That won't happen, of course, but that's what happens in Israel. You have the neighboring community that's we're supposed to say, "Oh, that's nice. Thank you for sending the rocket. I hope you do well. I hope you have a good Shabbos." You have to react, and the reaction is very painful. But I think ultimately, when people are willing to hear the real story is that we are there for those who are in need, and that's part of Herzl's vision. That was the utopia he was talking. It was not just for the comfort of the Jews; it was also to benefit the world. Herzl talked about the need to develop technology to build universities. Israel has the greatest universities in that whole part of the world, some of the greatest universities in the world, incredible universities in the country, and educating future scientists, future teachers, technologists, philosophers, historians, writers. And that is something that is highly educated, highly appreciated in Israel, and it does benefit the world. That was Herzl's vision, and that's come to fulfillment. So, and that's why I think the measure of the happiness chart is incredible, because it says that we've done something really right, following the example of Herzl, this poor guy who died at such a young age, but left a legacy that will forever endure. So I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'm going to open to comments and questions. The one more thing I want to say is, people often ask me, one of the questions I get, even in retirement, I get asked this a lot. So what do I put on the monument for my mother, my father, my husband, my wife? What do I write? I don't really want to be that wordy. So I go back to, I take people to two monuments at Herzl Cemetery, because the cemetery named after him. The Matzeva for Theodor Herzl says one word: Herzl. The monument to Yitzhak Rabin says one word: Rabin. You could have 10 paragraphs about, he was the prime minister and the chief of staff of the Israeli armed forces. He had every significant role in Israel imaginable. Could have had, 3,000 words on his Matzeva. Sometimes the greatest people are remembered in the simplest way, and that is powerful. That is really powerful, because you're going to go and you're going to see Herzl. It's going to say, what is this guy? What's he about? What did he do that was so important? And we're living the fact that he did something that was incredibly important in 44 short years, and only 10 years devoted to the Zionist cause, from 34 to 44. No, I'm feeling a personal pain today. I did a funeral for a man who was 48 years old. It's so tragic and it's so painful. Alex, thank God, lived a good life, a long life, short of 95. And so that was, very, very, that's very, that I find that very hard. And then I think of Herzl, it happens, in those days it was commonplace. Today it's thankfully less common, but it still happens, and it's very painful that someone doesn't have the opportunity to really fulfill. My comments today in the eulogy were, and it was obviously a difficult one, was to suggest that I told the famous story of Yitzhak Perlman. Not sure if it's a true story, but as I love it, so I still tell it, about how he was doing a concert, I think at Carnegie Hall, and one of his violin, one of the strings broke mid-concert, and he reconfigures the piece, and no one in the audience knows that there was a problem. So someone who, after the fact, finds out that he was playing the second half of his very complex piece with 4 strings, not 5. How do you do it? How did you do it? He said, I make music with what remains. Sometimes we're given, a difficult challenge in life, but we have to find that music. We have to find that poetry, that inspiration to get us through. more challenging times. And when someone like Herzl leaves us early, the young man today who serves I do, you know, you have to look and you have to find something about him that's going to live on, something about him that you're going to make sure lives on. That's making the most of the music that remains. And I think that, in a sense, was the legacy of Herzl. And maybe it's not less than ironic that Israel is incredibly prolific in songwriting, in music, in winning song festivals. Really goes way above its population in terms of making of talent, of making sure that the music of Jewish history, of Jewish life, continues to resonate in the world. So I'm going to stop. It's great. I get to give a 1-hour sermon. I usually couldn't do that on Shabbos, but I'm going to open to comments now. And if any people want to speak from your heart, any questions or just comments that you want to make, feel free to offer those comments. And I'd be let's listen to you as opposed to listening to me for a little while. Somebody must say something. No? Okay, good. Paul's asking an interesting question. Okay. What do you say to Adam Kinzinger, who outspokenly criticized Israel for not doing enough for Ukraine, such as sharing the Iron Dome? Well, I suspect, I'm not an expert here, but I suspect that Israel does not have the authority to do that without the United States' permission, because Iron Dome is a joint project of the US and Israel. That would be seen by the Americans as it's a very painful dilemma Israel finds itself in, because look, you're dealing with, we have large Jewish populations in Russia, large Jewish populations in Ukraine, Syria, Egypt, Russia in control of Syria, allowing Israel to attack Hezbollah out, locations, not allowing Israel to fly over Syria. If they weren't going to do that, if Israel angers the Russians and they close the skies to Israel, that is a major security dilemma for Israel. And I'm sure they're tearing their kishkas out. It's really painful, because you want to do, in their hearts, they really want to support Ukraine. They're finding whatever they can do to support. But the Americans and even the Canadians aren't in much of a different position, because the sanctions are, that is going to take, that's going to be a trickle down thing to really affect, and that doesn't seem to be, because Putin, he controls the media, he controls the they're hearing his Torah. So it's very difficult for people to really know what's going on. Some will know, but many don't know. And he gets away with it. But it's just in a very precarious position. I mean, I wish they could do more. Clearly, I think it's, and they're struggling, because they're balancing the safety of Israel, which has to be paramount. I mean, the question is, they can't afford to have open season from Hezbollah firing rockets in Israel. Hezbollah has like 100,000 rockets in Syria. With Russia there allowing Israel, when necessary, to take down some of their installations and looking the other way, that's a huge security advantage for Israel. So it's a very precarious situation to be in. And it's fine. I think Zelensky understands that. He stopped saying that they can't do the free zone, the air free zone, or the fly, whatever.
No fly.
Yeah.
No fly.
No fly. Thank you. The no fly. They can't do it because that'll be a direct war with Russia, and it's World War III. So that's clear that, and he knows that. He stopped asking for that. Now he's like, do more. So people have to be very creative. How do you do more? It's very, and supposedly it's hard to say that, it says that Bennett has relations with Putin and with Zelensky. He talks to both of them. That's probably helpful. At some point, not too many people. Biden's not talking to Putin now, and they can't. They're because he's understandably declared him to be a war criminal, probably with validity. But that's basically there's no conversation happening there. Maybe there's stuff happening with underlings. I imagine there's some kind of dialogue going on somewhere. Very painful situation. But what Israel is doing, I think, is behind the scenes stuff to help. I don't think in a military fashion. Look, the Americans won't even let Poland send their Alta planes, like these old planes that at Zerbruchen. They won't even let them send it, because that can be seen as, Israel doesn't have planes like that to send. But the Americans won't. I mean, that's really a bigger challenge. Why won't they send those planes? Because that would be seen, they're afraid, as an act of war. It would escalate, and they're really afraid of it escalating, because you're dealing with a Michigan. Very, very, very difficult. So I don't know. I mean, Kinzinger, well, he's retiring, right? So I guess maybe that's a good thing. I don't take his criticism that seriously. I mean, it's great to, what are they supposed to do? And they can't share the Iron Dome. That's really silly, because that's the U.S. would have to agree to that. They will never agree to that. And the U.S. can give them the Iron Dome. They're not doing it. They're afraid to escalate. They're giving them like rocket launchers, which are effective. And the only blessing here is that the Russians are so incompetent. They have a lousy army. They have the tanks, they have the numbers, but they can't find. I haven't heard the news lately. I have a very busy day today, so I haven't really had time to follow the news. But it's a difficult situation. Any other questions or comments? So in that case, friends, you'll forgive me if I end tonight a little bit earlier than the last couple of weeks, because I've had a couple of really difficult days, and I still have to now go ready.
I left one for you in the chat box.
Oh yeah, okay. Thank you, Bernie. Thank you. How do you deal with Jewish anti-Semites, particularly the young ones, Bernie? That's incredibly painful, and it's hard to know the numbers we're dealing with. It's not, but it's certainly the present. You have groups like Jewish Voices for Peace. That is a horrific group that cause great harm. People say it's coming from Jews, so it can't be anti-Semitic, and it is profoundly anti-Semitic. There is such a thing as self-hatred. I mean, there really is there, but it's dangerous. I don't think they're dominant but it's there. It's serious. You see, I'm a little, I belong to an organization. I'm going to Washington in May for a conference. I belong to an organization that's called, I actually named it. They were trying to come up with a name, the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition. And it's a group of rabbis of all denominations that are very, very strong on commitment to Israel, because we've seen certain places where there's a weakening. Even in rabbinical schools, we've seen very troubling signs amongst people that are going to be future rabbinic leaders who are not showing commitment to Israel. And that's very troubling to we old guys, and to many who are not so old, but who are basically very, very troubled by that direction. So, and if you have rabbinic leadership that is going to be encouraging people away from commitment to Israel, that is extremely troubling, and we have to be on the alert. So that's, I'm part of this group, this organization. I think there are about 150 rabbis involved, again, cross-denominational, from Orthodox to Reform, Reconstructionist, conservative, all who are very, very concerned. One of the strongest pieces against Jews who criticize Israel too strongly was from Amiel Hirsch, who's a prominent Reform rabbi, and he's a Reform leader who wrote one of the strongest condemnations of Jews who take an anti-Israel stand. And I think that's really very critical. Were I still in the pulpit, I would be, and if I ever have a chance, I would be preaching that and just saying, we can't be popular. We got to really call a spade and really confront this. We won't defeat it, but I think if we can marginalize it, I do feel that in our community, there's still a clear majority that are very, very solidly behind Israel. But there are those who aren't. And the fact is, again, it doesn't mean to say, as Deborah Lipstadt says, even though they still won't confirm her, that she's very strong in Israel, but she says, criticism of Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitic, because everyone in Israel criticizes Israel. Go to a cafe in Tel Aviv, she says all the time. And that's all they're doing. They're criticizing the government. That's what Israelis do. Everyone criticizes everybody. But fundamental love of Israel, fundamental belief in the validity of Israel existing as a Jewish state, fundamental commitment to Israel's survival and security, that's not negotiable. Yeah. You can disagree on politics. Yeah, we all do that. Everyone does that. I mean, whenever there's the left wing or the the center wings are in government, so the right wing is unhappy, vice versa. When Begin was prime minister, so you had Rabin and others who were not happy. When the other way around, that's the dynamic. That's democracy. But there has to be a fundamental line where you say there are red lines here. There are places that we do not go. My organization was involved in a controversy several years back, actually before I became president. It was before my time, but there was the issue of, when I was president of the RA, I was a member of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, the only Canadian to serve in that role. I think the only other Canadian ever to be in that position was the late Julia Koshitsky of blessed memory, and we should recall her today too, and all the good that she did in our community. So I think she was president of something, with some American organization, and she was also on the President's Conference. And I was for 2 years. I really loved it. It was fun. But there was a vote that took place that we did not admit J Street. and that was very controversial. People were really angry, and it was, there were some of our rabbis were, some of the conservative rabbis were divided on that issue. But the idea was basically that sometimes there was a question about, how strong was their support of Israel, and in times of danger, they were basically coming a little bit close to being with the wrong people. And so we were concerned about that, but there were those who said, no, they should be, it's the voice that should be at the table. So that was very controversial. But I came in after that controversy. And they're not on the conference. I mean, the Malcolm Homeline, who I brought to the shul a couple of years ago, who's retired now. He's still there as in an honorary capacity, but he was the CEO of the conference for decades. He's a serious guy and he's tough. He doesn't take anything. He doesn't. So he was going to make sure they wouldn't get in. And I sort of with him on that. But it was controversial. It's a problem. So Bernie, you're raising a very significant problem. I think it may be sometimes overstated, but not always. I think it's a bigger problem in the U.S. than in Canada. There are problems in the American political system more so than in Canada, where you have the extreme left wing of in politics that are not friendly to Israel. You also have the extreme right wing that are, I would say, if they're not anti-Semitic, they're just crazy. But so you have, the extremes are never good. But basically, people who are in the center tend to be more favorable to us, and that's what we have to build those, strengthen those bonds. And there's some people we'll never convince. We had a JNF event in the shul a few years back. We had a speaker by JNF, and the speech was disrupted by people from Jewish Voices for Peace who came in, who interrupted, started jeering and screaming and throwing things. I think we had Marvin Elkin doing security, so the problem was quickly resolved. But those, Marvin should be well. I think those, people weren't going to mess with him. But it was troubling. We had our Shinshinim were there, and they were crying. They were traumatized by that because they never saw Jewish anti-Zionists. They never saw that before. They were traumatized. We had to spend a lot of time with them, saying this is not the general population, but they had never seen that before. They were really shocked by it. I remember it was several years back. I remember it as if it were today. Any other questions or comments? I think if that's the case, I'm going to end a little bit early, but not, we're almost at an hour and a quarter, which is good. And my energy is a bit sapped today because it's been a very strenuous few days. So please understand. I'm thankful for all of you being here. And we will have one more session in 2 weeks, somehow playing with the Haggadah. And I'll figure out in the next 2 weeks what I'm going to talk about. I don't know yet, but we'll try to make it fun and some innovative and interesting stuff to bring to Passover Sidurim. And maybe this year, God willing, we will be able to have more people at your Sidurim than you've had in the past couple of years. Let's hope. We don't know. I mean, it's still crazy. I went to Yorkdale yesterday because I only go to Yorkdale if I have to go to the Apple store. And I had a problem with my iPhone. It was a hardware problem that I'm not going to explain what the problem was. And they had to fix it, and they did. They were great. I'm traveling next week, and I need to be able to charge it with a wire charger. And I've never charged it with a wire charger. I didn't realize that didn't work, so I had to get so. So I did a survey of that Yorkdale. This is the week where you don't have to be masked. I would say that 80 to 90% of people in the mall were masked.
Yeah,
I was too. I mean, I just Brenda would murder me if I wasn't, but I was also masked. But it was I would say most people that hasn't taken off yet. I think people have been more cautious than government. So it's hard to say. Who knows? I'm going to California for a couple of days next week, and there I think nobody will be masked, I suspect. But my first travel in over 2 years, and we'll see what happens. I have to pass the COVID test first. We'll see if I pass it. If not, I'll be around here. We'll see. So wishing all of you well, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you for those who made very nice comments, and Marla and others. I appreciate that very much. And Karen, I'm sorry that I don't get to catch all of the chat because I have trouble enough focusing on what I'm talking about. And I did get to record most of it, but not the first 10 minutes, unfortunately. Thank you for the reminders. Thank you all for being here. Stay well, stay healthy, and busy Shabbat coming up this week and next week. We have extra Sifrei Torah as we wind down the month of Adar Sheni, and we prepare for Nisan next Shabbat. this Shabbat there are 2 Sefer Torah, next Shabbat 3 Sefer Torah. Michael will be busy because I think he's the only one who does Hagba now. He's going to have to do 3 Hagbas at the same time or something. I have to figure out how that's going to happen.
At the same time.
He's very talented, so I'm sure that will work. Guys, good night. And I
night.
encourage you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're very welcome.
Thank
I
you.
encourage you to follow, if you know, look for Noah Tishby. You know, if you know, her book is really worthwhile. And if you like audiobooks, you can get the audiobook. It's really outstanding. She really is good. And even if you sound like me, who knows a lot of it, it's just very refreshing the way she presents it. So all the best. Good night. And
Night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Take care.
I'll leave you
Thank you,
online for
Rabbi.
a couple of minutes
Thank
if you want to
you.
talk to each other.
Good night, everyone. Be well, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
How do we turn this off?